She gave away her last piece of cornbread to a starving stranger, and a powerful man watched from the shadows, changed forever by what he saw. In the brutal summer of 1886, one overlooked woman would do something so quietly extraordinary that it would set in motion a chain of events neither she nor anyone around her could have predicted. No one at the Callaway boarding house thought Abigail Rowan was anything more than the heavy woman who kept the kitchen running and her mouth shut. They were wrong. This is her story. And if it moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1886 came down on Harlow, Texas, like something personal. It wasn't just the heat, though the heat alone was enough to crack a man's spirit. It was the way everything dried out and stayed that way, the way the dirt roads turned to powder and the sky went white by 10 in the morning, bleached of any real color. Cattle were dying on ranches 30 miles out. Wells were dropping. Farmers were talking in that quiet, careful way men talk when they don't want to say the word ruin out loud, but they're thinking it every waking hour. In the middle of all of it stood the Callaway boarding house on Prentice Street. 3 stories of weathered wood and peeling paint, always smelling of grease and lye soap, always needing something fixed that nobody could afford to fix. It had 11 permanent boarders, a rotating cast of travelers passing through, and one cook who held the whole operation together without ever once being thanked for it. Her name was Abigail Rowan. She was 34 years old and had been working the Callaway kitchen for going on 6 years. She was a big woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with thick hands that had been calloused since her early 20s, and dark hair she kept pinned back so tight it gave her a permanent look of mild severity. People who didn't know her thought she was stern. People who did know her, really knew her, were mostly the pots and pans she talked to between the hours of 4 in the morning and 10 at night. She was not invisible exactly. People saw her, they just didn't look. The boarders would come to the dining table 3 times a day and eat what she made and push back their chairs and leave without once registering that someone had woken before dawn to make any of it happen. Mrs. Callaway, who owned the place, would appear around noon each day to check the pantry ledger and remind Abigail that they were running low on flour or that she'd used too much salt on the previous night's stew, always with the tone of a woman addressing a slow child rather than the person who single-handedly kept her establishment from collapse. Abigail had learned not to respond to that tone. She'd learned a lot of things by not responding. She had come to Harlow after her husband died, James Rowan, a decent man who worked the rail lines and was killed in a coupling accident outside of Abilene when Abigail was 28. No children, no family close enough to matter. She'd had 2 choices, find another man fast or find work. She found work. Some days she wasn't certain she'd chosen correctly, but she'd never been the kind of woman who wasted much energy on that kind of thinking. The Callaway kitchen was small, hot, and poorly ventilated. The wood stove ran all summer with no apology. The icebox was unreliable. The pantry stocks were always thinner than they should have been because Mrs. Callaway spent money on the appearance of the front parlor rather than on the supplies that actually fed people. Abigail made do. That was what she did day after day. She made do, she improvised, she stretched what was there, and she kept 11 people and a steady stream of strangers fed without anyone understanding how difficult that actually was. On the evening of July 14th, 1886, a Tuesday, though Abigail had stopped tracking days of the week sometime in the spring, she was doing the final calculations for the night's meal when she realized something that made her set down her wooden spoon and stand very still. She had 11 boarders to feed. She had enough for 10. The drought had cut into delivery supplies. The corn shipment that was supposed to come Monday hadn't arrived. The flour barrel was down to its last scraping. She had made a corn porridge for supper, stretched it with a little fatback and some dried onion, and she had managed to make it work. Barely. She had set aside a piece of cornbread from the midday meal, her one small act of keeping something for herself. She hadn't eaten since early morning. She planned to eat that cornbread after the boarders were settled and the kitchen cleaned, sitting alone at the prep table the way she did most nights, too tired to do anything more than chew and stare at the wall. She was wrapping it in a cloth to keep it from drying out further when she heard the knock at the back door. The back door of the Callaway kitchen opened onto a narrow alley that ran behind Prentice Street. Deliveries came that way, and occasionally drifters looking for scraps. Abigail had a policy about drifters. She would give them what she could, and she wouldn't make them feel lesser for asking. But tonight she genuinely didn't have anything left to give. She opened the door anyway. Standing in the alley was a woman she recognized from around town, Ruth Calhoun, a widow whose husband had died of fever the previous winter. Ruth was gaunt in the way people get when they've been not eating for long enough that their body stops registering hunger and just starts consuming itself. Beside her, pressed against her hip, was her son. He looked about 7 or 8 years old. He had the same hollow quality his mother did, that stillness that wasn't peace, but exhaustion. "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Rowan," Ruth said. She didn't say she was hungry. She didn't ask for anything. She just stood there with her boy and apologized for existing near a kitchen door. Abigail looked at them for a moment. She thought about the cornbread in her hand. She thought about how her stomach had been growling since 2 in the afternoon. She thought about the boy's eyes. "Hold on," she said. She went back to the prep table, unwrapped the cornbread, and broke it in half. Then caught herself and put both halves back together and wrapped the whole piece back up. She brought it to the door and held it out to Ruth. "It's not much," Abigail said. I've got some leftover drippings I was going to throw out. Let me put those in a jar for you, too." Ruth took the cornbread with both hands like it was something fragile. "I'll pay you back when—" "You don't owe me anything." Abigail said it plainly, without warmth or coldness, just as a fact, the way she said most things. "Come back tomorrow morning before 7 if you need breakfast. I can usually find something extra before service." She handed over the jar of drippings. Ruth said thank you 3 times. The boy looked up at Abigail with an expression she didn't have a name for. She closed the door and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a minute before lighting the lamp again. She did not eat that night. What Abigail didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that a man had been standing at the far end of that alley. Cole Mercer was not a man who typically lingered in alleys off Prentice Street. He was, by any practical measure, one of the most significant landowners in Grady County, the owner of Mercer Ranch, 12,000 acres of rolling grassland that was currently losing the same battle with the drought that everyone else in the county was losing. He had been in Harlow to meet with the county land office about a water rights dispute that had been festering for the better part of 2 years, and he was walking back toward the hotel when he cut through the alley as a shortcut. He had stopped when he saw the woman at the back door of the boarding house. He wasn't eavesdropping. He had simply stopped moving when he saw the exchange, the way you sometimes stop when you witness something that doesn't announce itself as significant, but lands on you anyway. He watched the heavy-set woman in the apron hold out that piece of cornbread. He watched her go back inside and come out with a jar. He watched her turn away the widow's attempt to offer repayment with 2 simple words, "You don't owe me anything," and mean them. Cole Mercer had been in business long enough to recognize performance versus truth. He'd shaken hands with land agents who smiled like friends and filed papers against him the next morning. He'd had ranch hands who worked hard when he was watching and barely lifted a finger when he turned his back. He knew the difference between generosity that wanted to be seen and generosity that didn't know anyone was looking. He stood there a moment longer after the kitchen door closed. Then he walked on. But he didn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, Abigail was in the kitchen by 4:15 as always. She had the fire going in the stove and a pot of coffee on before the clock in the parlor struck 5. She was making biscuits, real ones, with the last of the butter, because she'd managed to talk the dairy farmer 2 streets over into extending their credit 1 more week, when she heard a soft knock at the back door just before 7. Ruth Calhoun and her boy. Abigail had 2 biscuits ready. She gave them each one and poured the boy a cup of watered-down milk. Ruth sat on the step outside the door and ate with a quietness that made Abigail feel something she couldn't quite identify. Not pity exactly, and not relief. Something in between. "How long has it been this bad?" Abigail asked. She was leaning in the doorway, drinking her own coffee. "Since March," Ruth said. "I took in some mending work, but it dried up. People don't spend money on mending when they're worried about eating." She paused. "Your biscuits are very good." "Thank you. Do you like cooking, or is it just work?" Abigail considered that. Nobody asked her that. "It's just work," she said. Then, honestly, "But I'm good at it. That matters." Ruth looked at her. It should matter more than it does. Abigail didn't answer that. She refilled the boy's milk. After they left, she went back to the prep table and was measuring out lard when Mrs. Calloway appeared in the kitchen doorway, earlier than usual, wearing a look Abigail had learned to brace for. "I saw you feeding someone at the back door this morning," Mrs. Calloway said. "A widow and her child. I used 2 biscuits from the boarder's overflow." "There is no overflow in this establishment. I made extra specifically so there would be." Abigail kept measuring. "It didn't cost you anything. It cost me supplies. It cost me a teaspoon of flour and a 1/4 inch of lard." She looked up then, meeting Mrs. Calloway's eye directly. "I won't stop doing it." The silence in the kitchen got very loud. Mrs. Calloway was a woman who was accustomed to having the last word. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, "The dining room needs the tables set by 7:30. She walked out. Abigail went back to measuring lard. Cole Mercer came into the Calloway boarding house at 11 that morning for the midday meal. This was not his habit. He typically ate at the hotel when he was in town, but he'd woken up thinking about the woman at the back door, and he'd decided, with the straightforward logic of a man used to acting on decisions, that he wanted to find out who she was. He took a table in the corner of the dining room. When the boarder's girl brought him coffee, he asked who did the cooking. "Miss Rowan," the girl said. "She does everything." "Tell her I'd like to compliment her on the meal, if she has a moment." The girl looked faintly alarmed, the way people do when you deviate from expected behavior, but she went. 10 minutes passed. The food came out. A beef and onion stew over cornmeal mush with pickled greens on the side. Bread that was somehow still fresh despite clearly being yesterday's. It was, Cole thought, the best meal he'd eaten in Harlow in 4 visits combined. Abigail appeared in the dining room doorway about 5 minutes after he'd finished. She had taken off her apron, he noticed. A small dignity. She had flour on her sleeve that she hadn't noticed. "You wanted to speak to me?" she said. She stood at a slight distance from the table, not deferential but not familiar either. She was taking his measure in the same businesslike way, he realized, that he was taking hers. "I did. I wanted to tell you that was an exceptional meal." He meant it. "Thank you. I'm Cole Mercer. I own the Mercer Ranch out on the county road. I know who you are." She didn't say it like she was impressed. She said it like it was information she happened to have. He almost smiled. "How long have you been cooking here?" 6 years. "Do you ever think about cooking somewhere else?" There was a beat. "Is there a reason you're asking me that, Mr. Mercer?" "I have a ranch that's struggling through this drought. I've got 18 hands to feed and a household that's been without a real manager for 8 months. The woman who used to run my kitchen left to go back east after her husband died." He kept his voice even, practical. "I'm not here to flatter you, Miss Rowan. I watched you give your supper away last night in that alley, and then I ate your cooking this morning, and I think you're exactly the kind of person I need running my operation." The change in her expression was very small, but he caught it. The slight stiffening, not of offense but of wariness. The look of someone who was trying to decide if they were being handled. "You were in that alley," she said. "I was passing through it. I wasn't trying to spy." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you offering?" He told her. The wage was 3 times what she made at the Calloway. Room and board, her own quarters, full authority over the kitchen and household management. A 3-month trial period, with the option to extend if both parties agreed. Abigail looked at him steadily. "Why would you hand authority to someone you met 5 minutes ago?" "I haven't handed you anything yet. I'm offering a trial." He leaned back slightly. "And I didn't meet you 5 minutes ago. I watched you give away your last meal to a woman you don't owe anything. That's more information about a person's character than most interviews give you." She looked down at the table between them. He could see her thinking. Not performance, actual thinking, the kind that moves behind a person's eyes. "I need 2 days to give Mrs. Calloway proper notice," she said. "That's fair. And I'd want to bring Ruth Calhoun on as kitchen help. She needs the work." He blinked. He hadn't expected that. "The widow?" "She's reliable and she needs something stable. If I'm managing your household, I'm managing the staff too. That's my condition." Cole Mercer sat with that for a moment. A woman he'd spoken to for less than 10 minutes was already negotiating the terms of her staff. "Fine," he said. "Then I'll be at Mercer Ranch Thursday morning." She picked up his empty coffee cup and walked back toward the kitchen without waiting to be dismissed. Cole watched her go. He'd come into Harlow worried about water rights and drought, and a land baron named Silas Granger who had been filing paperwork against him for 2 years. He was leaving with something he hadn't expected to find, someone who answered a question he hadn't quite known he was asking. He left a generous tip on the table. Then he went to send a letter to his foreman telling him to prepare the spare quarters. Abigail gave her notice to Mrs. Calloway that afternoon. The conversation was brief and unpleasant in the particular way that conversations with Mrs. Calloway tended to be. The woman managed to make Abigail feel simultaneously irreplaceable and disposable, which was a difficult trick, but one she'd practiced for years. "You'll regret leaving a stable position," Mrs. Calloway said. "I expect I might," Abigail said. "I also expect I'll survive it." She spent the next 2 days training the girl, Dottie, on the most critical parts of the kitchen work. She left detailed notes about the supplier accounts, the pantry ledger system, the specific way the stove ran hot on the left side and had to be compensated for. She wrote it all down in her precise handwriting without being asked to, because she was the kind of person who left things better than she found them, even when she had no obligation to. On Wednesday night, she packed her single trunk. 2 dresses, 1 good. Her mother's mixing bowl, which she'd carried from Abilene and would carry everywhere. Her recipe ledger, 12 years of notes, adjustments, substitutions, things she'd figured out through failure. A book she'd been reading for 4 months and hadn't finished. Thursday morning, before first light, she slipped a note under Ruth Calhoun's door 2 streets over. It said, "Bring your son. I have work. Come to the Mercer Ranch by noon." Then she hired a cart to take her trunk to the county road, and she didn't look back at the Calloway boarding house as she left. She had spent 6 years in that kitchen, cooking for people who barely knew her name. She had fed hundreds of strangers. She had stretched supplies and filled gaps and held a creaking operation together through will and competence and the refusal to let things fall apart on her watch. Not one person had ever asked her what she wanted. She was 34 years old. She was tired, and she was good at her work, and she had nothing sentimental to say about leaving. What she had was her trunk and her bowl and her recipe ledger and 2 days' worth of planning already churning in her head about what a drought-stricken ranch kitchen would need. The cart rolled out of Harlow as the sky began to lighten in the east, going from black to a deep, reluctant blue. Abigail sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the town disappear behind her. She had no way of knowing what she was heading toward: the drought-cracked land, the skeptical ranch hands, the lawsuits, and fire, and a man named Silas Granger who would come to see her as the most dangerous obstacle between him and everything he wanted. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the air smelled different outside of town. Drier, hotter, open. She let herself breathe it in. The Mercer Ranch sat 7 miles outside of Harlow on a stretch of land that had probably been beautiful once before the drought got its hands on it. Abigail saw it first from the top of a low rise in the county road. The main house, a 2-story structure of rough-hewn limestone with a wide front porch, surrounded by outbuildings, a barn, 2 bunkhouses, a smokehouse with a collapsed roof, and what had once been a kitchen garden that was now mostly cracked dirt and dead stalks. Beyond the buildings, the grassland rolled out flat and pale, the kind of color that grass turns when it's given up. The stock pond at the far edge of the property had shrunk to about 1/3 of its normal size. You could see the water line it used to keep, a dark ring on the clay bank like a bruise. It looked exactly like what Cole Mercer had described, a place that was losing. The cart driver set her trunk down near the front steps and left without ceremony. Abigail stood there for a moment, looking at the property with the same practical attention she'd given the Calloway kitchen on her first day 6 years ago, assessing, cataloging, figuring out what the problems were before anyone told her what they thought the problems were. She had been standing there maybe 3 minutes when a man came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw her. He was somewhere in his 50s, lean and weathered, with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades in bright sun. He looked at Abigail the way people sometimes did, that quick involuntary assessment that took in her size and her plain dress and her worn traveling bag, and came back with an opinion before she'd said a word. You the cook Mercer hired? He said. I'm the household manager Mr. Mercer hired. Abigail Rowan. She didn't extend her hand. She'd learned a long time ago that some men didn't know what to do with a handshake from a woman, and it just created awkward shuffling. You're the foreman? Walt Briggs. He said it like he was still deciding something. You need help with that trunk? I can manage it. I'd like to see the kitchen first, if you don't mind. He minded. She could see that. But he turned and led her around to the back of the house anyway, and Abigail followed, taking in everything as she went. The state of the woodpile, the state of the water barrels, the state of the back porch, which had 2 broken boards and a screen door hanging off one hinge. The kitchen was large, which was its only virtue. The stove was a good one, a big cast iron range, 8 burners, but it hadn't been properly cleaned in what looked like months, and the grease buildup on the back panel was the kind that liked to catch fire at inconvenient moments. The pantry shelves were poorly organized, with duplicates of things they didn't need stacked in front of things they did. There was a sack of cornmeal that had been opened and improperly resealed, and she could smell from 3 feet away that it had begun to turn. 2 of the 6 water buckets had cracks. The cutting table had a warp in it that would make precise work difficult. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned around once, slowly. How many men are you feeding? She asked. 18, when everyone's here. Some days less if they're working the far pastures. 3 meals a day? Breakfast and supper. Midday they take what they can carry. What have they been eating? Walt's jaw moved slightly. Whatever Hector puts together. He's been cooking since Dora left. Where's Hector now? Probably out back. She found Hector behind the smokehouse, a young Mexican hand of maybe 20 who looked profoundly relieved to see her. He confirmed what she'd suspected. He had no training as a cook, had been drafted into the role because he was the youngest and least able to refuse, and had been keeping 18 men alive on salt pork, beans, and whatever cornmeal hadn't gone bad. You did a good job with what you had, Abigail told him. He blinked like he hadn't expected that. It wasn't very good food. No, she agreed. But you kept everyone fed and nobody died, and that's actually harder than it sounds when you don't know what you're doing. Do you want to keep working in the kitchen? I want to work the cattle, he said immediately. No offense. None taken. Go talk to Walt. Cole Mercer arrived from town late that afternoon. By the time his horse came through the gate, Abigail had already pulled the turned cornmeal and thrown it behind the barn to let the birds deal with it, reorganized the pantry shelves by category and frequency of use, identified which water buckets could be patched and which needed replacing, and started a list, 3 pages long, of what the kitchen needed in the next week, the next month, and before winter. Cole came around to the kitchen, which she appreciated. He didn't summon her to the front room like she was being called to account. How does it look? He asked. Like nobody's been managing it, she said, which you told me. So that's not a criticism, just a confirmation. She handed him the 3-page list. The urgent things are on the first page. The stove back panel needs to be scraped and cleaned before I use it at full heat. There's a grease buildup that's a fire risk. I'll need 2 new water buckets, another 50 pounds of cornmeal, and access to whatever account you use at the dry goods store in town. Cole looked at the list. He turned to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. He looked up. You did all this in one afternoon? I had a lot of time on the cart ride over. He almost smiled again. It was the same almost smile she'd seen in the Callaway dining room, a thing that got to the edge of his face and then thought better of committing. Walt said you wanted to look at the kitchen before you'd even let him help with your trunk. I wanted to know what I was dealing with. And? I've dealt with worse. She took the list back and folded it in half. Your men have been eating poorly for 8 months. That affects their energy and their temper and their judgment. Good consistent food is part of managing a working ranch. It's not a luxury. I'll need proper supplies, and I'll need the authority you promised me to organize them. You have it. Your foreman doesn't think I belong here. Cole paused. Walt's been running this ranch for 12 years. He has opinions about most things. That's fine. I'm not here to make him like me. She set the list on the counter. I'll have a proper supper ready by 6. Is there anything you don't eat? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between amusement and respect, and something more careful than either. Not particularly? Good. Come back at 6. He left. Abigail started the stove. Ruth Calhoun arrived just before noon the next day, her boy Samuel in tow, carrying everything they owned in 2 flour sacks. Abigail had spoken to Cole that morning and secured Ruth a fair daily wage, a corner room in the main house near the kitchen, and the understanding that Samuel could earn small tasks for additional pay when he was old enough to be useful. Ruth had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Abigail with an expression that Abigail didn't know what to do with, so she just handed her an apron and told her to start on the dishes. That was how they began. The ranch hands noticed the change in the food within 2 days. Not that they said anything directly to Abigail. They wouldn't have known how to begin that conversation, most of them. But the dining table got quieter in a different way, the specific quiet of people who are concentrating on eating because the eating is worth concentrating on. Abigail had made a venison stew with dried herbs from the sad remains of the kitchen garden, thickened properly, with real cornbread instead of the dense slabs Hector had been producing, and fresh coffee instead of the reheated pot that had apparently been a standing fixture of every meal. A hand named Decker, big, red-faced, the kind of man who took up space on purpose, looked at his bowl and then at the woman who'd put it in front of him and said, "This is different." "Yes," Abigail said, "it's better." "I know." He opened his mouth like he was going to say something else and then seemed to decide against it, which she thought showed decent instincts. Walt Briggs said nothing about the food. He sat at the end of the table and ate and gave Abigail the same evaluating look he'd given her on the first day, a look that hadn't changed much in a week. He was a man, she had figured out, who made decisions slowly and kept them once made. She didn't try to charm him or argue with him or demonstrate anything directly for his benefit. She just did the work and let him watch. The harder task was the supplies. The drought had disrupted the normal rhythms of trading and distribution throughout the county. The dry goods store in town was running low on staples. The feed store had put limits on how much any one account could purchase per month. Abigail spent the first 2 weeks driving the supply wagon herself. Walt had assigned a hand named Pete to drive, but Pete had a tendency to take his time and visit the saloon, so after the second late delivery she told Cole she'd drive it herself, and he said fine, and that was that. On those drives she began talking to the other ranch operations she passed. She wasn't trying to build anything yet. She was just gathering information the way she'd always gathered it, by asking direct questions and listening carefully to the answers. She found out which ranches still had functioning root cellars. She found out which families had put up preserves in the spring and now had more than they could use. She found out that a rancher named Hagen, 15 miles south, had a working well and was pumping more water than he needed, while a family called the Prestons, 12 miles east, had a well that had gone dry but had a smokehouse full of cured meat from a good slaughter they'd done before the drought tightened. She brought this information back to Cole. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm suggesting we trade. You have good stock of flour and salt that Hagen doesn't have access to right now. Hagen has water. The Prestons have smoked meat. We could arrange a rotation. We're not in the trading business. Every ranch out here is in the trading business right now, whether they know it or not." She kept her voice patient. "We're all going to be fighting over the same shrinking supplies at the same store in town, or we can work out a system that keeps everyone's kitchen running. I'd rather do the second thing." Cole looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since the second supply drive." He sat back. "Set up the trades. But run the terms by me before you commit to anything." She ran the first 3 trades by him. After that, he stopped asking her to. The kitchen garden was the project that gave her the most trouble. Not because of the work involved, but because of Decker, who apparently had opinions about the garden that nobody had asked him for. The garden was 40 feet by 30 feet, enclosed by a low wooden fence on the south side of the main house. It had been productive once. She could see the evidence of good soil in the darker patches, the remnants of proper rows, the wire trellis frames that were still standing even though nothing grew on them. 8 months of neglect and drought had done serious damage, but not irreversible damage if you knew what you were doing. Abigail started reclaiming it in the mornings before kitchen work began, pulling dead growth, amending the soil with what compost she'd been collecting from the kitchen scraps, preparing the beds for what could still be planted given the season. Ruth helped when she could. Samuel turned out to be genuinely useful in the garden, with the low-to-the-ground attention to detail that children sometimes have. Decker materialized one morning while she was on her hands and knees working a row of soil. "That garden's done," he said. "Nothing's going to grow in this heat." Abigail sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "I'm going to plant drought-resistant varieties. Cowpeas, amaranth, some sorghum. They'll grow. I've been on this ranch 3 years. I know what this soil does. I've been growing things in Texas soil for 20 years. She went back to working the row. "You're welcome to your opinion, Decker." He stood there for another moment, apparently unused to being dismissed by someone on their hands and knees in a garden. Then he walked off. 3 weeks later, when the first green shoots came up in that garden, small and stubborn and real, Decker walked past it in the morning on his way to the barn and slowed down and looked at the row for a long time. He didn't say anything to Abigail. But the next morning he came to the kitchen door and asked, without quite meeting her eyes, whether there was anything in the garden that needed tending that he could do before first light. She handed him a trowel. He became, quietly and without fanfare, the most reliable person in the garden after that. He never apologized for doubting her. She never asked him to. That was, she was learning, how most things worked at Mercer Ranch. Men here didn't do things with a lot of words around them. They adjusted and they moved on and they showed what they'd decided by what they did next. It was actually easier than the boarding house, where everything ran on the specific social performance of being agreeable. Here, competence was the currency, and she had plenty of it. The water situation was the thing that kept Cole up at night. She could see it at the way he'd come into the kitchen after supper sometimes and pour himself coffee and stand at the window looking out toward the stock pond, not talking, just looking. She'd learned not to fill that silence with chatter. He wasn't the kind of man who wanted chatter. But one evening in the 3rd week, when Ruth and Samuel had gone to bed and the kitchen was quiet, he set his cup down and said, without turning around, "Granger's lawyers filed another motion." "What kind?" "Challenging the survey that established our eastern water rights." He turned then. He looked tired in a way that was different from the physical tiredness of ranch work, the deeper tiredness of a man who's been fighting the same fight for too long. "He's been after those rights for 2 years. Every time we beat back one motion, there's another one. His lawyers work faster than the territorial court does." Abigail dried her hands on her towel. "What's his argument?" "That the original survey was done improperly, that our eastern fence line is off by a 1/4 mile, which would put the primary water source on disputed land." He paused. "The survey wasn't done improperly. I was there. But he's got money and patience and a judge in 2 counties who owes him something." "Do you have the original survey documents?" "My lawyer in Abilene has copies." "What about the original, the one that was actually filed?" Cole looked at her. "It would be in the county records office." "Have you pulled it recently?" He was quiet for a moment. "No." "It might be worth having someone look at it, not your lawyer. Someone who knows how land records get misfiled or how survey documents sometimes get amended after the fact without the original owner being notified." She said it carefully because she was speculating, but she'd heard things on those supply drives, the way Granger's name came up in conversation with a particular weight to it, the way people paused before they said what they thought of him. Cole watched her. "That's a serious thing to suggest." "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm saying look at the original." He picked up his coffee cup. "You know, Walt thought I'd lost my mind when I told him I'd hired a boarding house cook to manage this household." "What does Walt think now?" "He told me 2 days ago that the crew's working better." He set the cup down. He said it like he was reporting the weather, like it wasn't a remarkable thing. A pause. "But for Walt, that's practically a speech." Abigail folded her towel over the rack. "I'm not trying to impress Walt Briggs." "I know." Cole looked at her with that careful expression she'd seen a few times now, the one that wasn't quite readable. "That's part of why it's working." She went to bed that night and lay awake for a while, listening to the dry wind move across the prairie outside her window. It was a different sound than the town sounds she'd slept through for 6 years. No wagon noise, no voices from the street below, no creak of the boarding house settling into itself. just wind and the occasional sound of the stock moving in the barn and the vast, indifferent quiet of the open country. The ranch was not fixed. The drought wasn't over. Granger's lawyers were still filing. The stock pond was still shrinking. There were 18 men depending on a kitchen that was running on traded goods and careful rationing and a 3-page list that kept getting longer. But the cowpeas were coming up. The kitchen was clean. The crew had eaten 3 good meals today and would eat 3 more tomorrow. Walt Briggs had told Cole Mercer that the men were working better. For now, that was enough. She was nearly asleep when she heard it. A sound from outside, low and distant, something between a rumble and a hiss that didn't fit the normal register of a ranch at night. She lay still, listening, trying to identify it. She couldn't. She told herself it was nothing. It was probably nothing. She was wrong. The sound Abigail had heard was fire. She knew it the moment she stepped onto the back porch, in the gray pre-dawn dark, and smelled it. Not wood smoke, not the controlled burn smell of a stove or a hearth, but something wilder and more indiscriminate, the smell of land itself burning. She stood on the porch steps and looked southeast, and even in the dark she could see it. A low orange glow sitting on the horizon like a second, wrong kind of sunrise, maybe 4 or 5 miles out, spreading laterally as she watched. She went inside and banged on the wall between the kitchen and the room where Ruth slept. "Ruth, get up and get Samuel up. Stay in the kitchen." Then she went to the front of the house and hammered on Cole's bedroom door with her fist. "Fire! Southeast! It's moving." She heard him hit the floor before she finished the sentence. By the time Cole came downstairs pulling on his boots, Abigail was already back in the kitchen filling every available pot and bucket with water from the indoor pump. Not because water was going to stop a prairie fire of that size, but because it might save the outbuildings if the wind shifted and the fire came close. Ruth was at the stove without being asked, stoking the fire back to life, starting coffee, her face tight but her hands steady. Cole came through the kitchen at a near run and stopped when he saw what Abigail was doing. "The wind's from the south," he said. "It could push it toward the east pasture." "Where are your hands? I'm going to the bunkhouse now." "Wake them all, and tell Walt I need 3 men who aren't going to the fire line to stay here and help me move supplies to the stone cellar." She was already stacking dry goods away from the pantry wall. "If this reaches the outbuildings, I want the food stores protected first." He looked at her for a half second like he was going to say something, then thought better of it, and went. Within 20 minutes, the ranch was awake and moving. Cole took 12 men toward the fire line with shovels and wet burlap sacks. The old drought country method of beating fire back, brutal and exhausting work. Walt Briggs went with them. Decker went. Pete went. The 3 men who stayed behind, 2 young hands named Cass and Everett, and Hector, who'd been formally returned to the cattle crew but came back to help when he saw the glow in the sky, worked under Abigail's direction without arguing, which surprised her slightly. The next 6 hours were the hardest she'd worked since she couldn't remember when. She transformed the kitchen into the kind of operation she'd never had to run before but understood instinctively, a place of continuous output, because the men on that fire line were going to come back in rotations, burned and smoke-choked and half-dead with exhaustion, and they were going to need water and food and somewhere to sit for 15 minutes before they went back out. She set Ruth on a constant rotation of coffee, water, and cold cloths. She put Samuel, who was 10, old enough to be useful and young enough to be told exactly where to stand and not move, on the task of keeping the water buckets filled from the indoor pump. She cooked in bulk, a massive pot of beans, cornbread in 4 batches, salt pork sliced thin and fried fast, hard-boiled eggs by the dozen because they were portable and didn't need plates. She also, without being asked, set up a rough medical station at the kitchen table. She had no formal training, but she had grown up on a working farm, and she'd spent 6 years in a boarding house where travelers came through with every kind of road injury, and she'd learned from watching and from necessity. She had clean cloth strips torn from old linens. She had the whiskey Cole kept in the cabinet above the pantry. Not for drinking now, for cleaning burns. She had lard for the skin, and she had a steady hand and a direct manner that, as it turned out, was exactly what burned and smoke-shocked men needed. The first men came back around 8 in the morning. 2 of them had burns on their forearms where burning grass had caught on their sleeves. One, a quiet older hand named Sumner, had breathed too much smoke and couldn't stop coughing. Abigail sat them down, gave them water first, then food, then dealt with the burns while they ate, working around their forks without apology. "This is going to sting," she told the first man, whose name was Briley. "Yes, ma'am." He winced when the whiskey touched the burn, but didn't pull his arm back, which she respected. "The skin's not broken deep. Keep it clean and it'll heal." She wrapped it with cloth strips and told him to keep it dry. "Can you go back out?" "Yeah." He flexed his fingers experimentally. "Yeah, I can." "Eat first." He ate. He went back out. This repeated itself throughout the morning, men cycling in and out of the kitchen in a ragged rhythm, eating fast and going back, their faces and clothes carrying the smell of smoke so thick it began to settle into the kitchen itself, into the curtains and the flour sacks and Abigail's hair. Ruth moved through it all without complaint, refilling cups and exchanging burned cloths for clean ones, and doing the quiet, necessary work of making men feel human again for 15 minutes before they went back to the brutal work outside. At some point around 10 o'clock, Abigail had stopped tracking time precisely. The wind changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the air coming through the kitchen window, the quality of the smoke smell changing direction. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the back porch and looked southeast and saw that the fire had bent. It was no longer moving east, it was moving north, toward the ranch's northern pasture. She went inside and told Cass to ride out to the fire line and tell Cole the wind had shifted north. He went at a run. Then she went back to the stove because there was nothing else she could do from here, and the men were still going to need to eat. It was during that hour, that anxious middle hour, when the fire's direction was uncertain and the kitchen was briefly quiet and Ruth had taken Samuel outside for air, that a man came to the front door of the ranch house. Abigail heard the knock because she was in the front hallway moving a box of medical supplies to the closer storage. She opened the door. The man standing on the porch was not a ranch hand and not a neighbor come to help. He was well-dressed in the particular way of men who worked in offices rather than fields. Clean collar, good boots with no dust on them, which meant he'd arrived in a closed carriage. He had a wide, mild face and the manner of someone who was accustomed to being let in. "Miss Rowan?" he said. She didn't ask how he knew her name. "What do you want?" "My name is Doyle. I work for Mr. Silas Granger." Mr. Granger wanted me to come personally, given the emergency, to offer his assistance. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He's deeply concerned about the fire and wanted me to convey his sympathies to Mr. Mercer and to everyone on the property. "That's kind," Abigail said. "Tell him thank you." She started to close the door. Doyle put a hand out, not touching the door, just a gesture, a pause. "Mr. Granger also asked me to speak with you specifically, if you were available. He has a proposition he thinks you might find interesting, given the current instability of the situation here." Abigail looked at him. The fire was burning 4 miles from where she stood. Cole and 15 men were out there in it. She had beans on the stove and a kitchen table set up for treating burns. "What kind of proposition?" she said. "Mr. Granger is opening a new establishment in Harlow, a hotel and dining room, much larger than anything currently in town. He's looking for a head cook and household manager of significant experience to run the operation." Doyle reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. "He's prepared to offer a very generous salary, more than twice your current arrangement, I'm told. He believes your talents are underutilized in your current position." He held out the envelope. Abigail looked at it. She didn't take it. She'd grown up around men like Silas Granger, not men with his money, but men with his particular way of operating. She'd been around them long enough to recognize the mechanism. You didn't crush people directly when you could pick them apart piece by piece. You went after the water rights with lawyers, and while the ranch was distracted by a fire, you came to the back, or in this case the front, door, and offered the most competent person on the property a reason to leave. She thought about the cornbread she'd given Ruth Calhoun. She thought about Ruth in the kitchen right now, who had a room and a wage for the first time in 8 months, because Abigail had made it a condition of her own employment. She thought about Samuel turning 10 next month, who had asked her 2 days ago if he could learn to make biscuits. She thought about Decker in the garden before dawn, crouched over the cowpea rows with a trowel, not saying anything, just working. She thought about Cole Mercer on that fire line right now, with burned and exhausted men working beside him, fighting for land that someone with lawyers and patience was methodically trying to take from him through every legal and extra-legal mechanism available. "No," she said. Doyle's mild expression didn't change. "I'd encourage you to read the—" "I said no." She kept her voice level. "You can tell Mr. Granger that I'm not available and that his timing is noted." A beat. Something moved behind Doyle's professional composure. Not quite surprise, but an adjustment, a recalibration. "Mr. Granger doesn't often take no for an answer." "I expect that's true." She put her hand on the door. "But I'm not talking to Mr. Granger. I'm talking to you. And I've given you my answer." She paused. "You should go. The wind has shifted, and if it comes this direction, you don't want to be on this road in a closed carriage." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Her heart was beating faster than it had any right to. She was aware of a narrow, quiet anger that she hadn't known was in her until just now. Not a hot anger, but a cold, structural one, the kind that settles into your bones and stays. Then she went back to the kitchen and checked the beans. Cole came back in the early afternoon with Walt and the main crew, all of them scorched and gray-faced and smelling like they'd been turned on a spit. The fire had been turned at the north pasture line, barely. They'd lost about 60 acres of grass and one section of the north fence. No buildings, no cattle, miraculously. Cole walked through the kitchen door and stopped when he took in the setup. The organized rows of food, the medical station, the coffee that was somehow still hot, the presence of men already seated and eating who'd come in ahead of him in the last rotation. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Sit down," Abigail told him. "You look terrible." He sat. She put food in front of him and then checked his hands. He had a burn across the back of his right hand that he hadn't mentioned and wouldn't have, probably, until it got infected. She cleaned it with whiskey while he ate, working efficiently, and he hissed through his teeth but kept eating. "Someone came to the door this morning," she said. "Who?" "A man named Doyle. He works for Granger." She kept her eyes on the burn, wrapping it. "Granger sent him to offer me a position at a new hotel in town. Considerably better pay than what I make here." Cole's fork stopped moving. "I told him no," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to." She tied off the bandage and looked up at him. "I did it because I wanted to, and because I know what it was. It wasn't a job offer. It was Granger trying to pull out the structural piece while the house was distracted." She paused. "I also want you to know he timed it for when you were on the fire line, which means he knew about the fire early enough to send a man while it was still burning." Cole absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the way his expression moved through several things before settling on a controlled, careful stillness. "He has people who report to him. He has people everywhere, I think." She sat down across the table from him, which she didn't usually do. "Cole, the visit was a message as much as it was an offer. He wanted you to know he could reach inside this operation at its most vulnerable moment. He wanted me to know I had options. He was testing both of us." "What do you think we should do?" She'd been thinking about it all morning, in the spaces between the burns and the beans and the water buckets. "I think the legal fight is his main weapon, and the lawyers are going to keep filing until you run out of money to respond, or the court gets tired and rules in his favor. But I also think he needs isolation to win. He needs ranches out here to be separate, fighting their own drought, too stretched to pay attention to what he's doing with the land records." She straightened. "He can't file against all of us at once." Cole looked at her steadily. "All of us. The Hagans, the Prestons, the Alderman family up the county road, the Burkes, the ranches I've been trading with for 6 weeks." She kept her voice even. "I've been inside most of their operations, Cole. I know what they have and what they need. I know who's struggling and who has capacity. If those operations were connected, really connected, not just trading food, but sharing information and resources and watching each other's backs, Granger's isolation strategy stops working." The kitchen was quiet. Walt Briggs was sitting at the far end of the table, she realized. She hadn't been sure he was listening, But he was looking at her now with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the evaluating skepticism of the first days, but something closer to attention. Real attention. You'd have to talk to all of them, Cole said. I know. Some of them don't trust each other. The Hagans and the Burkes had a fence dispute 2 years ago. I know that too. She'd heard it on one of the supply drives. But they both trust that I'm not trying to get anything for myself. I'm just the woman who traded them cornmeal for cured pork. She paused. Sometimes that's enough. Cole rubbed his uninjured hand across his face. He was exhausted. She could see it in the weight of him, the way he was sitting. 15 hours of firework on top of 2 years of legal fighting and 8 months of a drought that wasn't getting better. Walt, Cole said, what do you think? Abigail had not expected him to ask Walt. She looked down the table. Walt Briggs was quiet for a moment. He had his coffee cup between his hands, and he was looking at the table surface. Then he looked up, not at Cole, but at Abigail. I think, he said slowly, that when I came in from that fire line and there was hot food and clean bandages and organized men, I stopped asking certain questions. He paused. I should have stopped asking them about 2 weeks ago. He looked at Cole. I think you should let her do what she's suggesting. Abigail kept her face neutral. Walt caught her eye, briefly. It was the closest he was going to get to an apology. And they both knew it, and they both left it there. Cole nodded. All right. He pushed back his chair. But I need to tell you something first. About the survey documents. He'd gone to the county records office 2 days before the fire. He'd had a lawyer friend in Harlow pull the original survey documents, as Abigail had suggested weeks earlier. What they'd found was not exactly what anyone had expected. The original survey was intact, properly filed. But there was a second document filed 4 months ago, a supplemental notation that cited a correction to the eastern boundary coordinates. It was filed quietly, without notification to the Mercer account. The signature on it was a county surveyor who, Cole's lawyer had determined, had been hired for 2 other jobs in the past year by companies whose ownership, when you traced it far enough back, connected to Silas Granger. Cole laid this out plainly, without drama, the way he said most things. Abigail sat very still and listened. So the argument that your survey was done improperly, she said when he finished, is based on a correction document that Granger's own man filed. That's what it looks like. Does your lawyer think you can prove it in court? He thinks he can, but Granger knows we found it. He probably anticipated we'd find it eventually, which means he'll move faster on the legal challenge now, try to get a ruling before we can build the case properly. Cole's voice was measured, but she could hear the strain underneath it. He's going to push hard in the next few weeks. Whatever you're thinking about the neighboring ranches, it needs to happen soon. Outside the kitchen window, the sky to the southeast was still faintly hazy with the remains of the smoke. The north pasture fence needed rebuilding. Sumner was still coughing in the bunkhouse and would probably need a few days of rest before he could work again. The kitchen was a mess of pots and cloth strips and empty cups, and the particular exhausted disorder of a place that had run at full emergency capacity for 6 hours. There was so much to do. Abigail stood up and began clearing the table. I'll start with the Hagans, she said. I have a supply run scheduled for Thursday. I'll go to the Prestons on Friday. She stacked plates with the automatic efficiency of a woman who had been doing this her whole life. In the meantime, I need you to write down everything your lawyer told you about that supplemental filing. The surveyor's name, the dates, the companies, all of it. Why? She set the plates by the basin. Because information is the one thing Granger can't file a motion against. She turned around. And because I want every family I talk to this week to understand exactly what he's capable of, not as a rumor, but as documented fact. Cole watched her. That careful expression again, the one she still couldn't fully read. You're angry, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Abigail thought about Doyle on the front porch with his clean boots and his envelope and his mild professional smile, offering her a way out while the ranch burned behind her. Yes, she said simply. I am. She picked up the stack of plates and carried them to the basin and started washing, and the sound of water running in the kitchen was the last sound of that long, brutal day, ordinary and necessary, and in its own way, the sound of something that had quietly decided not to quit, The Thursday supply run to the Hagen Ranch took 3 hours longer than usual, and Abigail came back with an empty wagon bed, a handshake agreement, and a very clear picture of how frightened Otto Hagen actually was. He was a big man, Otto, German-born, broad through the chest, the kind of man who'd built his operation from nothing through sheer physical will and didn't easily admit when something was bigger than him. But when Abigail had sat across his kitchen table from him and laid out what Cole's lawyer had found about the supplemental survey filing, the false correction, the surveyor's name, the paper trail that led back to Granger's holding companies, Otto had gone very quiet in the particular way of a large man who is realizing that the threat he's been trying not to think about is more organized than he'd hoped. "He's done this to others?" Otto said. "We believe so. The pattern is the same. Wait for a drought or a hardship, file a quiet legal challenge, wear the operation down." Abigail kept her hands around her coffee cup. "He doesn't need to win in court every time. He just needs the legal fight to cost more than the land is worth." Otto was quiet. "I'm not asking for money," she said. "I'm not asking you to take on his lawyers. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to share information, what you're seeing on your property, what your neighbors are seeing, what's moving through the county that doesn't make it into the newspaper." She paused. "And I want to know if you'd consider coming to the Harvest Festival in Harlow next month with your family. All of you, together." Otto had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd refilled her coffee without asking and said, "My wife makes a sorghum cake. She's been looking for a reason to make it." That had been Thursday. Friday she went to the Prestons. Saturday, after kitchen work, she drove out to the Alderman property. Sunday, a day she normally kept to herself, the one morning she slept past 5, she went to the Burke family spread 12 miles up the county road. The Burkes and the Hagens hadn't spoken directly in 2 years over a fence dispute that had started as a surveying disagreement and curdled into the kind of personal silence that small communities sometimes calcified around. Abigail had known about it and had spent most of the Burke visit not talking about Granger at all, just sitting with Margaret Burke in her kitchen helping shell dried beans, listening to the woman talk about the drought and her eldest son who'd gone to work in Dallas, and the fence that had gone unmended on the north side because there was no one with time to fix it. Eventually Margaret had said, without quite looking at her, "I heard you've been talking to the Hagens." "I have. Otto Hagen told my husband 2 years ago that the fence was his responsibility and then did nothing about it for 6 months." "That sounds like it was handled badly." Margaret shelled beans. "It was. Is the fence still an active problem, or is it just an old one?" A pause. "Just an old one, I suppose." "The Hagens are good people who made a bad decision about a fence," Abigail said. "Granger's a man who's been systematically filing false documents to take land from families like yours. Those aren't the same category of problem." Margaret looked at her then. She was a practical woman. Abigail had recognized that the moment she met her, the specific practicality of women who'd built something in hard country and knew the difference between a grievance they could afford to keep and one they couldn't. "What do you need from us?" Margaret said. So it went, ranch by ranch, kitchen table by kitchen table. It wasn't a campaign. Abigail didn't think of it that way and didn't conduct it that way. She didn't make speeches. She didn't promise things she couldn't deliver. She sat in people's kitchens, and she talked plainly about what she knew, and she listened carefully to what they told her, and she let the connections form at whatever pace they were going to form. She was not a politician and didn't want to be one. She was a woman who understood that the most reliable unit of trust in hard country was a neighbor who showed up when you needed them and didn't ask for more than was fair. She had been that neighbor for 6 weeks before she started asking for anything. That mattered. Cole watched all of this from a careful distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't offer to accompany her on the ranch visits, which she appreciated. His presence would have changed the dynamic, made it about the Mercer operation specifically rather than about the broader community. She was operating in a space that his name and his money and his 2-year legal fight with Granger would have complicated. What he did do was work with his lawyer in Abilene. The man's name was Garrett Finch, and he was in Harlow twice in the 2 weeks after the fire. A thin, precise man in his 40s who spread documents across the front room table and talked through the case in the patient, detailed way of someone who understood that the person he was talking to needed to understand it fully, not just trust him. The supplemental survey filing was the key. If they could establish that the county surveyor who'd signed it had a financial relationship with Granger's holding companies at the time of the filing, the document could be challenged as fraudulent. The challenge would go to the territorial court in Abilene, which was outside the jurisdiction of the judges Granger had relationships with. It was a narrow path, but it was a real one. "How long?" Cole asked. Garrett looked at his papers. "If we file the challenge by the 1st of next month and request an expedited hearing based on active legal pressure from the opposing party, 3 months, maybe less. Granger will file something to delay it. He will. But delay works both ways. If we can hold the line on the water rights through the hearing process, the original survey stands." Garrett paused. "The problem is his next move. He knows we found the supplemental filing. He's going to come at this from another angle." He did. 12 days after the fire, Granger's lawyers filed a new motion. Not against the water rights this time, but against the ranch's grazing license on the eastern section, citing an obscure territorial statute about fire damage and land use. It was, Garrett told Cole, almost certainly a delaying tactic, something to occupy their legal resources and attention while Granger maneuvered on the survey challenge. But it required a response, and responses cost money, and money was something the drought had been eating steadily for 2 seasons. Cole told Abigail about the new filing one evening in the kitchen. He spread Garrett's letter on the table between them and let her read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "He's trying to exhaust you," she said. "I know. How much room do you have?" He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man deciding how honest to be about money. "Enough to fight one more round cleanly. After that it gets difficult." Abigail nodded. She didn't offer reassurance because false reassurance wasn't something she did. Instead, she said, "The Harvest Festival's in 3 weeks. I've spoken to the Hagans, the Prestons, the Aldermans, the Burks, and the Whitfield family off the South Road. All of them have agreed to come, bring their families, show up together." She straightened the letter on the table. "I want to talk to you about what we do when we're there." He looked at her. "I thought it was just community attendance." "It is. But Granger will be there. He always attends the Harvest Festival because it's the largest public gathering in the county, and he likes being seen as a man of standing." She folded her hands on the table. "I want everyone to see that we're not isolated, that the ranches out here are connected, that a legal fight against Mercer isn't a fight against one operation. It's a fight against a community that has been sharing food and water and labor through one of the worst droughts in 20 years. She paused. "You can't file a motion against that." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this since the morning after the fire," he said. "I've been thinking about it since Doyle showed up on the porch with his clean boots and his envelope," she said. "The moment I understood what Granger was actually doing, I started thinking about what would actually stop it." He leaned back. "Walt said something to me yesterday." "What did he say?" "He said," Cole paused, something in his expression that was almost amusement, but worn down to something quieter by tiredness. "He said that in 12 years of running this ranch, he's never seen the crew work as well as they do now, and that he thinks it's because they're eating properly and someone is paying attention to what they need before they have to ask for it." He looked at her. "He said he told me that because he thought I should know." Abigail said nothing. "He also said he owes you an apology for how he looked at you the first day." "He doesn't owe me anything." "He thinks he does. That's Walt." Cole looked down at the table. "He's not a man who says things like that easily." "I know." She stood and began clearing the supper things. "Tell him I said we're square." The 2 weeks leading up to the Harvest Festival were the busiest Abigail could remember. The ranch work didn't slow. Cattle still needed managing. The rebuilt north fence needed to be finished. The kitchen garden was producing now in the small, determined way of drought-resistant plants, cowpeas, and amaranth coming in steady enough to supplement the trading supply. Ruth had taken on more of the kitchen's daily management, which freed Abigail to spend more time on what she'd started thinking of privately as the network. The communication chain between the 5 ranch families, the sharing of information about what Granger's people were doing in town, who was visiting the land office, and when. It was Hector, of all people, who brought her one of the most useful pieces of information. He had gone into Harlow for supplies on a Wednesday and come back with a careful account of a conversation he'd overheard at the dry goods counter. Doyle, Granger's man, speaking to the store owner about a shipment of timber that was being ordered for a new construction project on the eastern county land. Timber for a building. On land that was currently under disputed survey. Abigail wrote it down and sent a message to Garrett Finch the same afternoon. Garrett's response came 2 days later. Granger was preparing to build on the disputed parcel. If he could establish physical presence on the land before the survey challenge was heard, it complicated the legal picture significantly. Not insurmountably, but it added time and cost and uncertainty. They needed the hearing date moved up. Cole spent 3 days on correspondence with Abilene, pushing Garrett hard, asking what it would take to get an expedited date. Garrett pulled a favor with a territorial court clerk he'd known for 15 years and came back with a date 6 weeks out, faster than anyone had expected, though still not fast enough to prevent Granger from beginning construction if he moved quickly. Abigail heard all of this and said, "Then we need the festival to go well." It went well. The Grady County Harvest Festival was held on the third Saturday of September on the grounds of the county fairgrounds outside Harlow. A collection of flat open land with a permanent pavilion, wooden tables, a bandstand that leaned slightly to the left, and had for as long as anyone could remember. The drought had thinned the usual abundance of harvest displays, and there was a subdued quality to the setup, a consciousness of difficulty that people were carrying even as they came out and tried to set it aside for a day. What was not subdued was the number of ranch families who arrived together. Abigail had not coordinated a procession. That would have been theatrical, and she was not interested in theater. But the Hagans came, Otto and his wife and their 3 children, arriving in their wagon just after the Mercer group, and the Prestons came 20 minutes after that, and then the Aldermans and the Burks and the Whitfields, and by mid-morning there was a cluster of 6 ranch families moving through the festival with the specific ease of people who had been to each other's kitchens recently and weren't strangers anymore. Margaret Burke and Otto Hagen's wife Clara were talking by the pie table within an hour. Abigail saw it happen, saw Margaret say something and Clara laugh, and the 2 years of fence dispute silence dissolve into the practical sociability of women who had more in common than they'd been allowing themselves to acknowledge. The food was Abigail's contribution, and it was significant. She had spent 3 days preparing, 24 loaves of cornbread, 4 large crocks of preserved cowpeas and seasoned broth, dried herb bundles from the kitchen garden, a tray of hard candies she'd made with Samuel's enthusiastic and largely unhelpful assistance. She set it up at a table under the pavilion and served it to anyone who came, and a lot of people came because food had been short enough in this county that a generous table drew attention. People she'd never met came to the table and ate and thanked her and asked where she was from. She told them she worked at the Mercer Ranch. Most of them knew the ranch by name. Some of them knew about the water rights fight with Granger and had opinions about it that they shared freely, with the directness of people who'd been watching a situation and waiting to say what they thought to someone who might actually be listening. She listened. Silas Granger arrived around noon. She saw him from across the pavilion, a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of physical presence that takes up more space than its actual dimensions. He had 2 men with him, and he moved through the festival with the ease of someone who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in a room. He stopped to talk to the county commissioner. He shook hands with the newspaper editor. He accepted a cup of cider from a vendor and surveyed the grounds with the comfortable gaze of a man taking inventory of what was his. His eyes found Abigail's table. She was serving cornbread to an elderly rancher and his wife when she felt the shift, the specific social weight of being looked at by someone who had made a calculation about you. She didn't look up immediately. She finished serving the couple, said something to make the wife smile, wiped the serving knife on her cloth. Then she looked up. Granger was still watching her. Across 40 feet of festival crowd, his expression was unreadable. Not hostile, not friendly, just the flat assessment of a man who had sent his representative to her door with an envelope and received an answer he hadn't expected. He held the look for a few seconds. Then someone spoke to him, and he turned away. She went back to serving cornbread. The public moment that Abigail hadn't planned for, hadn't planned at all, which was what made it land the way it did, happened about an hour later. The county commissioner, a man named Hayes, who was up for re-election in November and therefore acutely sensitive to the mood of a crowd, had gotten up on the bandstand to make the customary festival remarks. He talked about community and resilience and the challenge of the drought, the usual language of public address. Then he said that he wanted to recognize some of the people who had gone above and beyond to support their neighbors through the hardest summer in recent memory. He called out 2 families by name for their work during the fire. Then he said, "I also want to recognize Miss Abigail Rowan of the Mercer Ranch, who I'm told has been instrumental in organizing the food sharing and resource network among ranches in the eastern county over the past 2 months, and who kept the Mercer crew fed and treated during the wildfire last month under conditions that I understand were genuinely difficult." She had not known he was going to say that. She stood at her table with the ladle in her hand and felt the particular discomfort of someone who has spent their entire adult life being invisible and is suddenly, against their will, visible. People looked at her. Some of them clapped. Walt Briggs was standing 10 feet away, near the edge of the pavilion. She glanced at him involuntarily. He was not clapping, that would have been unlike him, but he was standing up straight, which for Walt had its own kind of weight. Cole was at the far end of the pavilion. He caught her eye and gave her a single nod, the kind that meant something without trying to mean too much. She gave the commissioner a short, awkward nod of acknowledgement and went back to serving food, because she didn't know what else to do with public attention and had never particularly wanted to learn. But the effect was real, and she felt it in the hour that followed. People coming to the table not just for food, but to talk to her specifically, ranchers and their wives, and a few people from town who had heard things, who wanted to ask questions about the water rights situation, who wanted to understand what Granger had actually been doing with the survey documents. She answered carefully and honestly and without exaggeration, because exaggeration had a way of collapsing under scrutiny, and she was not interested in building anything on an unstable foundation. By mid-afternoon, the thing she'd been trying to describe to Cole and hadn't quite found words for was visible in the physical space of the festival. The cluster of ranch families had expanded, drawn in other families from the northern and western parts of the county, people talking across old divisions and drought-era suspicions, and the conversation running through all of it had Granger's name in it more than once, in a tone that was not friendly. The newspaper editor, a small, observant man named Carver, who wrote a county weekly that Abigail had never read but several people had mentioned to her, came to the table and asked if she would be willing to answer some questions for the paper. "About what?" she said. "About the resource network you've built. How it works. How it started." He had a small notebook. "And about the survey dispute, if you're willing to speak to that." She thought about it for a moment. She thought about Garrett Finch and the expedited hearing date and the timber Granger was ordering for a building on disputed land. "Come to the Mercer Ranch next week," she said. "Bring your notebook. I'll have coffee ready." Carver came on Tuesday. The article ran in the weekly paper on Thursday, 3 weeks before the territorial court hearing. It was not a sensational piece. Carver was too careful for that. And Abigail had been precise and factual in what she told him. But it laid out the pattern of Granger's legal tactics clearly, cited the fraudulent supplemental survey filing by name, quoted 3 ranching families about the resource-sharing network, and included a description of the festival that made visible what Abigail had been quietly building for 2 months. Cole read it at the kitchen table and set it down. "Granger's going to be furious," he said. "I expect so. He might retaliate." "He might." She poured her own coffee and sat across from him. "But a man who's been operating in the shadows for 2 years has a particular vulnerability to being described plainly in a newspaper." She looked at the article. "He can file motions against your water rights. He can't file a motion against the truth." The day after the article ran, 2 more ranch families that Abigail hadn't yet spoken to sent word that they wanted to be included in the resource network. The county commissioner, whose sensitivity to public mood she'd already noted, made a remark at a town council meeting, which Carver also reported, that the territorial court hearing on the Mercer survey dispute was a matter of significant public interest, and that he hoped it would be resolved with proper attention to the documentary record. Granger's lawyers, Garrett told Cole, had filed a response to the expedited hearing request. It was thinner than their usual filings. The language was defensive in a way that Garrett said he hadn't seen from that office before. "He's losing the room," Garrett said, meaning the broader county, the community that Granger had always depended on, not paying close attention. Whatever she did at that festival, it worked. Walt Briggs came to the kitchen the evening after Garrett's report. Abigail was doing the end-of-day cleanup, and Ruth had taken Samuel to bed, and the kitchen was quiet. Walt knocked on the doorframe. He always knocked, she'd noticed, even though it was the main house kitchen, and technically he had as much right to walk through it as anyone. "Come in, Walt." He came in. He stood near the table with his hat in his hands, which meant he'd thought about this visit on the way over. He had a specific way of holding his hat when he was about to say something that cost him. "I owe you something I should have said a while ago," he said. "Walt, let me finish." He looked at the hat. "When Mr. Mercer told me he'd hired a boarding house cook to manage this household, I thought he'd lost his judgment. I want to be honest about that." He looked up. "I was wrong. About all of it. The way I looked at you when you came. What I assumed." He paused. "You saved this operation, not just the kitchen, the whole thing. I should have seen what you were a lot sooner than I did." The kitchen was quiet. Abigail set down her drying cloth. She didn't tell him it was fine because it hadn't been entirely fine and they both knew it. She didn't minimize it to make him comfortable. "I know it wasn't easy to say that," she said. "I appreciate it." Walt nodded once, the way men like him nodded when a difficult thing was completed and they wanted to move on from it with dignity and tact. "The North Fence crew finishes tomorrow," he said, back to his normal tone. "Should have the last section up by noon. I'll have lunch ready by 12:30. He put his hat back on and left. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment. Outside, the night air was still hot, but there was something in it that hadn't been there a month ago. A faint edge of change. The first suggestion that the season might eventually shift. The cowpeas in the garden were producing steadily. The stock pond was still low but hadn't dropped further in 2 weeks. The trading network was holding, and through it the ranches were sharing not just food and water but information and presence. The specific knowledge that they were not alone in what they were facing. The hearing in Abilene was 3 weeks away. There was still everything to lose. But there was also, and she felt this without wanting to overstate it, the weight of something built. Not finished, not safe, but built and real, and made of the kind of material that didn't come apart easily because it had been assembled out of practical need and honest dealing and the particular loyalty of people who had eaten at each other's tables. She turned off the kitchen lamp. She went to bed before 10 for the first time in 2 months, and she slept without hearing anything in the dark that worried her. The morning they left for Abilene, Abigail was up at 4 as always. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with it, while the ranch was still dark and quiet around her. And she thought about the piece of cornbread she had given to Ruth Calhoun in an alley off Prentice Street. It felt like a long time ago. It felt like something that had happened to a different version of herself. The woman who cooked for strangers in a boarding house kitchen and went to bed hungry and told herself that competence was enough, that doing the work well was its own reward, that wanting more than that was a kind of foolishness she couldn't afford. She didn't regret any of it. That wasn't what she was feeling. She was feeling, if she was being honest with herself, afraid. The specific kind of fear that comes not from expecting to lose, but from finally having enough at stake that losing would mean something. Ruth came into the kitchen at 5, found Abigail at the table, and without saying anything put bread onto toast and refilled the coffee. She sat down across from her. "How are you?" Ruth said. "I don't know yet." Ruth nodded. She understood the answer because she was the kind of person who gave honest answers herself when she had them, and didn't manufacture comfort when she didn't. That was one of the things Abigail valued most about her. "Samuel asked me last night if we'd have to leave if things went wrong in Abilene," Ruth said. Abigail looked at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." Ruth wrapped her hands around her cup. "I probably should have said something more reassuring." "Probably. But it was the right answer." Abigail looked down at the table. "If things go wrong, and I don't think they will, but if they do, you stay. That's not contingent on anything." She looked up. "You work for this ranch, Ruth, not for a particular outcome." Ruth was quiet for a moment. You got me this job. And Walt Briggs renewed your arrangement 2 weeks ago on his own authority, which tells you what you need to know. Abigail stood and took her cup to the basin. Cole is not a man who lets people fall through the floor if he can help it. Whatever happens in Abilene. Cole came downstairs at 6. He was dressed for the territorial court, not formally, because that wasn't his way, but cleanly and carefully, the way a man dresses when he understands that presentation is part of the argument. He came through the kitchen, poured coffee, looked at Abigail. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready since 4, what?" she said. He almost smiled. They rode to Abilene in Cole's wagon, with Garrett Finch meeting them at the edge of town, because Garrett had come down the day before to prepare. The territorial courthouse was a limestone building on the main street that managed to look both official and slightly provisional, as if it were still deciding how permanent it intended to be. They arrived an hour before the hearing. Granger was already there. He was standing outside the courthouse with his lawyers. 3 of them, Abigail counted, all with the well-fed, unhurried look of men who billed by the hour and weren't worried about the bill. Granger himself was as she'd seen him at the festival, tall, silver-haired, the absolute ease of a man who had won more than he'd lost and expected the pattern to continue. His eyes found the Mercer group as they arrived, moved over Cole, moved over Garrett, and then stopped on Abigail with the same flat assessment she'd felt across the festival pavilion. She met it without looking away and without making anything of it. Granger turned back to his lawyers. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. A plain rectangular space with a raised bench, a table on each side, and benches along the wall for observers. There were more observers than she'd anticipated. Word had gotten out through Carver's article and through the county talk that had been running for 3 weeks, and the benches held Otto Hagen and his eldest son Preston from the Preston Ranch, 2 of the Alderman brothers, and several people Abigail recognized from the festival whom she couldn't put names to, but who had come to her table and eaten her cornbread. Granger's side had people too. The county surveyor, whose signature was on the supplemental filing, sat in the back corner with the specific stillness of a man trying not to be noticed, and 2 men in town suits who Abigail assumed were associated with Granger's business operations. The judge was a woman of 60, which surprised everyone in the room except possibly herself. Her name was Judge Adeline Marsh, and she had been appointed to the territorial bench 18 months earlier from a court in Oklahoma. She had gray hair pulled back without vanity and eyes that moved around the room and took inventory before she'd said a word. Abigail liked her immediately. Garrett presented the Mercer case with the precise, documented clarity of a man who had spent 20 years in territorial courts and understood that judges like Marsh did not want theater. They wanted the facts in a usable order. He laid out the original survey, the proper filing, the 15 years of established water rights. Then he presented the supplemental correction document, its date, its signature, its claimed authority, and then methodically the evidence of the financial relationship between the signing surveyor and Granger's holding companies. 3 payments in 14 months, documented through the land office accounts. The most recent payment 6 weeks before the supplemental filing. It was not complicated. That was its strength. Granger's lead lawyer, a man named Ashby, who had the practiced fluency of someone used to making thin arguments sound substantial, presented the countercase with considerable skill. He acknowledged the payments, but characterized them as routine consulting fees unrelated to the survey work. He argued that the supplemental correction was a legitimate administrative action within the surveyor's authority. He questioned the chain of custody on 2 of Garrett's documents. He was good. Abigail, sitting behind the railing on the observer bench, listened carefully and felt the fear from the morning sharpen into something more focused, because Ashby was good, and Garrett's path was narrow, and the judge was unreadable. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Judge Marsh called a recess at midday. The room emptied into the hallway in 2 distinct clusters, Granger's group at one end and the Mercer group at the other. Cole stood with Garrett in a low, rapid conversation that Abigail stayed out of because it was legal strategy and not her domain. She stood near the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the Abilene street below. Wagons, foot traffic, the ordinary movement of a town that didn't know or particularly care what was being decided upstairs. Otto Hagen appeared beside her. "How do you think it's going?" he said quietly. "I don't know. The judge is careful. She paused. That's either good or it isn't. Garrett knows what he's doing. Yes. She looked at the street. Granger's lawyer is also good. Otto was quiet for a moment. My father lost land in Bavaria to a man like Granger. Different country, same mechanism. Find a legal angle, file paperwork, wear the other person down until they can't afford to fight anymore. He watched the street below. I swore when I came to Texas that I wouldn't let that happen here. He glanced at her. I wouldn't be standing in this building today if you hadn't come to my kitchen table. Abigail didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. You should have been to my kitchen table sooner, she said finally. I should have come in the first week. Otto made a sound that might have been a laugh. Maybe. But you came when you came, and here we are. The hearing resumed. Judge Marsh asked Ashby 3 follow-up questions about the consulting fee payments, specific, pointed questions about dates and authorizations that made Ashby's answers sound for the first time slightly rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Then she asked Garrett 2 questions about the original survey's chain of filing, which he answered with the precise citation of document numbers that came from having prepared for exactly those questions. Then Judge Marsh said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 7 days. The room exhaled. 7 days was a long time to wait, and Abigail had learned enough about legal proceedings to know that a ruling taken under advisement could go either way. But she had also watched Adeline Marsh's face during those final questions to Ashby, and she had seen something in the judge's expression. Not sympathy, not bias, but the specific focused attention of a person who has identified the place where the argument doesn't hold. She didn't tell Cole what she thought. She didn't know enough to be certain, and certainty she didn't have was a thing she kept to herself. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and the ride was mostly quiet in the way that rides are quiet after long, high-stakes days when there's nothing useful left to say. Cole handled the reins. Garrett had stayed in Abilene. The flat Texas landscape moved past on both sides, pale and drought-thinned and very large. Somewhere around the halfway point, Cole said, without particular preamble, "Whatever happens, I want you to know that what you did, the network, the festival, Carver's article, that changed things. Even if the ruling goes against us, it changed things. It won't be enough if the ruling goes against you. No, but it was the right thing to do regardless." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a man who says things like that easily." "I know." She looked at the road ahead. "That's why it means something." They didn't speak again until the ranch gate. The 7 days were the longest Abigail could remember. The ranch work continued because it had to. The cowpeas needed harvesting, the north fence crew started on a second section, the trading runs continued. Ruth managed the kitchen with increasing confidence, which freed Abigail in ways she hadn't anticipated, small pockets of time she didn't quite know what to do with because she had spent so long filling every available hour with necessary work that stillness felt like a problem to be solved. On the 4th day, Decker came to her in the garden, where she went in the early mornings now not out of necessity, but out of something closer to preference, the specific pleasure of watching things grow in ground that had been written off, and sat on the low fence and said, without looking at her, "You nervous about the ruling?" "Yes," she said. She was on her knees in the cowpea row, which was not a dignified position for a serious conversation, but she'd stopped caring about dignified positions in gardens around week 3. "Me too." He picked at the fence post. "I've been on 4 ranches. This is the first one that's felt like a place." He paused, with the halting quality of a man not practiced at saying things like this. "That's your doing, I think. Not entirely, but mostly." Abigail sat back on her heels. "It's everyone's doing." "Maybe, but someone had to start it." He stood up from the fence, apparently having said what he came to say, and ready to be done with the vulnerability of it. "I'm going to go fix the south gate hinge. The pin needs replacing, not just tightening." "I know." He walked off. She went back to the cowpeas. The ruling arrived on the 7th day, carried by a courier from Abilene, who handed the sealed envelope to Cole at the front porch just after breakfast. Cole took it inside and stood at the kitchen table with it. Ruth and Samuel were in the kitchen, Abigail was at the stove. Neither of them said anything. Cole opened the envelope. He read for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 45 seconds. Then he set the papers down on the table and put both hands flat on the surface and stood there for a moment. "We won," he said. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. Abigail turned from the stove. "The supplemental filing has been voided. Judge Marsh found sufficient evidence of financial conflict of interest to invalidate the correction document." He looked up. "The original survey stands. The water rights are confirmed." He paused. She also referred the matter of the surveyor's conduct to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. Samuel, who had been listening from the corner where he'd been shelling dried beans and pretending not to pay attention, said, "Does that mean we don't have to leave?" Ruth put her hand on his shoulder. "We don't have to leave." He went back to shelling beans with the focused relief of a child who has been quietly frightened for weeks and is trying not to show how much he'd been frightened. Abigail turned back to the stove because she needed a moment, and the stove was a reasonable place to take one. She stood there and looked at the fire through the grate and felt something move through her that she wasn't prepared to name in front of other people. It wasn't triumph, exactly. It was heavier and quieter than triumph, something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long, you forgot it wasn't part of your body. She heard Cole come to stand behind her, not close, just near. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She cleared her throat. "Give me a minute." He gave her a minute. Word reached the neighboring ranches by that afternoon through the network that had been built to share food and water and was now equally good at sharing news. Otto Hagen sent a short message that said, in its entirety, "Good. My wife is making the sorghum cake." The Prestons sent word that they were planning a gathering the following week if the Mercer Ranch was willing to host. Walt Briggs, who received the news from Cole in the yard, took off his hat and held it for a moment and then put it back on and went back to work, which was the most emotional response anyone had ever seen from him. Garrett Finch rode out from Abilene 2 days later with the formal documentation and stayed for supper, which Ruth and Abigail made together. A proper meal, not an emergency meal, not a stretched and rationed meal, but a real one, with the harvested cowpeas and fresh cornbread and a side of preserved plum that a woman from the Harvest Festival had sent over with a note that said simply, "Thank you for the table." The supper table had 14 people around it: Garrett, Walt, Decker, Hector, Cass, Everett, Sumner, Pete, the other hands, Ruth, Samuel, Cole, Abigail. It was loud in the particular way that tables are loud when people are released from tension they've been holding for a long time. Not wild, just genuinely at ease, the sound of people eating and talking without the background weight of what might go wrong. After supper, when most people had filtered out onto the porch or back to the bunkhouse, Cole found Abigail in the kitchen doing what she always did at the end of a meal: cleaning, organizing, putting things back in their places. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she could feel him there without turning around. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask?" "I've been thinking about what this ranch is and what I want it to be." He came in from the doorway and stood near the table. "When I bought this land 12 years ago, I had a clear idea of what I was building: a cattle operation, land that would hold its value, something that would outlast me." He paused. "That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. In a way I didn't understand until this summer." Abigail turned around. Cole was not a man who prepared speeches. She could see that this was unplanned, the careful, slightly effortful quality of a man saying something true that he hasn't rehearsed. "What you built here this summer wasn't just a functioning kitchen. It was the reason people showed up at that courthouse, the reason Otto Hagen and Margaret Burke were standing in the same room, the reason Carver wrote that article." He looked at her steadily. "You built something that I didn't know how to build and wouldn't have thought to try. And I don't want to lose it when the crisis is over. I don't want this ranch to go back to being just a cattle operation." She waited. "I want to rebuild the north section into something that can house extra people, families in difficulty, widows, families that have been pushed off their land by men like Granger or just by hard seasons." He kept his eyes on her. "I want this place to be what it was during the drought, somewhere people can come and find work and food and get back on their feet. But I can't do that alone, and I can't do it without someone who understands that work better than I do." He stopped. Then, plainly, "I want you to stay, not as a trial arrangement, not as a household manager, as my partner in building what this place could become. In every sense, I mean that." He looked at the table for a moment, which was the most uncertainty she'd seen from him, then back at her. "I realize that's a significant thing to say." The kitchen was quiet. Abigail thought about the Calloway boarding house, about 6 years of cooking for strangers who didn't know her name, about Mrs. Calloway and her pantry ledger and her voice that said, "Slow child," without saying it, about riding out of Harlow in the gray pre-dawn with her trunk and her mother's mixing bowl and not looking back. She thought about Ruth and Samuel with their 2 flour sacks, about Decker in the garden before sunrise, about Walt Briggs with his hat in his hand saying, "I was wrong," about Otto Hagen's hands wrapped around his coffee cup saying, "You came when you came, and here we are." She thought about the cornbread, that single piece of cornbread that she'd wrapped in a cloth to save for herself and given away instead, in the dark, to a woman she didn't owe anything, because it was the right thing to do and there was no one watching. There had been someone watching, and that watching had set in motion every single thing that followed, which was a strange and uncomfortable and, if she was honest, somewhat awe-inducing fact about how the world occasionally worked. "I'm not a simple woman," she said. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't let go of them easily. I'll run the household the way I think it should be run, and I'll tell you plainly when I think you're wrong about something. I know that. And I want Ruth and Samuel to have something permanent here, not dependent on circumstances. I already plan to offer Ruth a permanent position. Samuel can start learning the ranch work next year if he wants to." She looked at him. This man who had stood in an alley off Prentice Street and seen something in a woman giving away her supper that he couldn't stop thinking about. This man who had taken a 3-page list and said, "Set up the trades and full authority and fine," and trusted her with the things that mattered before she'd given him any reason to, except the meal she'd put in front of him and the fact that he'd watched her give away her last piece of food. He was not a simple man either. He was stubborn and overextended and had spent 2 years fighting a legal battle that had worn him down to something close to the bone before she arrived. He made decisions quickly and sometimes without enough information. He held things close when he should have talked about them, but he was honest. And honest was the thing she'd never been willing to compromise on, not in 6 years at the Calloway, and not in the last 4 months here. And she wasn't going to start. "All right," she said. He let out a breath that told her he'd been holding it. "Don't make a production of it," she said, and went back to washing dishes. He laughed, a real laugh, sudden and genuine and slightly startled, the laugh of a man who didn't laugh often enough. He picked up a drying cloth and started on the dried dishes, and they stood at the basin together, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like supper and coffee, and the faint green smell of the cowpeas from the garden. And outside the window, the sky over the ranch had gone from its white summer glare to a deep, cooler blue that said, finally, quietly, without drama, that the season was beginning to change. The drought broke fully 6 weeks later. Not with a single storm, but in the gradual, incremental way of real weather, a series of rains across October that brought the stock pond back to 2/3 and turned the pale grassland back toward something living. The north pasture grass came in thin but real. The cowpeas had already been harvested and stored. The kitchen garden had, against most expectations, produced steadily until the first cold snap, and what it produced had supplemented the trading network and the ranch table both. The Territorial Attorney General's office opened a formal inquiry into the county surveyor's conduct in November. Silas Granger's name appeared in that inquiry in relation to 4 separate land disputes across Grady and 2 neighboring counties. He did not appear at the county commissioner's winter reception that December, which people noticed, and his lawyers filed nothing new against the Mercer water rights through the end of the year, and then through the next year, and eventually the Mercer account stopped expecting them to. Some people leave when you beat them. Some people recalculate. Either way, the land stayed where it was. The gathering that the Prestons had proposed became a regular thing. Not a formal arrangement, not a meeting with rules and membership, just a rotating supper that moved from ranch to ranch through the winter months and kept the connections that the drought and the crisis had built from going slack. Abigail cooked at most of them. So did Clara Hagen and Margaret Burke and the Preston women, and the suppers got to be the kind of occasion that people looked forward to and brought their best dishes to and dressed slightly better for than the occasion strictly required. Ruth Calhoun ran the Mercer kitchen through the winter with a competence that had grown so much since the summer that Abigail sometimes came in and found things already done that she would have done herself, and done better than she might have managed. Samuel learned to tend the garden and helped Decker with the fence sections and had an ongoing argument with Hector about the correct way to cinch a saddle that seemed from the outside to be mostly about who was more stubborn and less about the saddle. Cole and Abigail were married in February, in the front room of the ranch house, with Walt Briggs as witness, and Ruth and Samuel and the core crew in attendance, and no ceremony other than the words they said to a justice of the peace, who came out from Harlow in a good mood because he'd been told there would be a proper meal afterward. There was. Ruth made the biscuits and Abigail made everything else, and Decker, who had been tending the kitchen garden since August, brought in the last of the winter greens that had been growing under cloth covers and presented them with the specific awkward pride of a man who had grown something and wanted someone to know it. "They're a little small," he said. "They're fine," Abigail told him. "Put them on the table." He put them on the table. Years later, when people in Grady County talked about the Mercer Ranch, they talked about it the way you talk about a place that has a particular quality to it. Not easy to name, but recognizable the moment you're there. The north section was rebuilt by the time the next hard summer came, and it housed 3 families that first year. A widow with young children whose husband had been killed in a ranch accident, an older couple whose land had finally given out after 2 bad seasons, and a young Mexican family that Hector had quietly vouched for, and who turned out to be among the hardest workers the ranch had ever had. The kitchen garden expanded twice. It fed the ranch, fed the north section families, fed the neighbors on the worst weeks, and sent produce into the rotating suppers every season it produced. Abigail kept the recipe ledger she'd carried from Abilene and added to it steadily. Not just recipes, but notes, the kind of operational knowledge that came from managing a large household through hard seasons. What to store and how to stretch what was there, how to feed 20 people well when you only had supplies for 15. She also, at Ruth's insistence, wrote down the story of the trading network, how it had started, how it had been built, what had worked, and what hadn't. Ruth said she should write it for the people who would come after, who would face their own droughts and their own grangers, and might want to know that it was possible to do what had been done. Abigail thought that was sentimental. She wrote it down anyway. The cornbread was always on the table, not as a symbol, she didn't think in symbols, but because it was good food that people liked, and it could be made in quantity from what the kitchen kept in stock. Every family that passed through the north section ate it. Every supper gathering had it. Samuel, who eventually grew into a serious and capable young man with strong opinions about fence lines and a gift for the cattle work, claimed for the rest of his life that the best thing he had ever eaten was the cornbread he'd been handed in a dark alley off Prentice Street when he was 7 years old and so hungry he could barely stand. He wasn't wrong, though Abigail always told him that the memory was doing most of the work. What she didn't tell him, what she never said out loud to anyone, because it wasn't the kind of thing she knew how to say, was that she had given away that cornbread because she couldn't watch a child go without and do nothing, and she had never once thought it would lead anywhere except to an empty stomach for herself and a small, private sense of having done the right thing. She had not given it to change her life. She had given it because it was what you did when you had something and someone needed it, and you were the only one there. The fact that a man had been standing in the shadows watching, the fact that what followed had followed. None of that was the point. The point was the moment itself, the decision made in the dark with no audience and no expectation of return. That was the thing she believed, if she believed anything, that the acts no one sees are the ones that actually build you. That character isn't what you do when the stakes are clear and people are watching. It's what you do in the alley after a long day when you're tired and hungry, and the easiest thing in the world would be to close the door and eat what you saved for yourself. She had spent 34 years being invisible, and she had spent them becoming someone worth finding. The cornbread was on the table that night, and every night after, and the door of the ranch house was open to anyone who needed it, and the kitchen was warm, and the season outside was whatever season it was, and there was always enough, not because the world was generous, but because she had made it so, one careful, honest, unglamorous decision at a time. That was the whole of it. That was enough.